Sometimes a baby has gotta do what a baby's gotta do, so it's time for this big baby to review Rugrats Adventures in Gameland. Based on the classic Nickelodeon 90s cartoon turned modern-day CG nightmare, Rugrats Adventures in Gameland attempts classic 8-bit 2D platforming and features a sleek HD facelift. But is this take on the Rugrats franchise Reptar-tacular, or is it a dirty diaper tossed out of someone's window? Let's find out in our full review. You know what really stinks? If you aren't subscribed to the channel, so be sure to do so if you love indie games as much as we do. You can also support the creation of independent content just like this at patreon.com/idreamofindiegames to gain Discord access, early shows, and so much more. We're covering the games that the gaming echo chamber are too afraid to, and we can't do it without your support. Thank you. The Rugrats series originally launched in 1991 on Nickelodeon and mostly revolved around a group of toddlers named Tommy, Phil, Lil, and Chucky. This was a wonderful time for cartoons, as Rugrats typically aired alongside Ren and Stimpy, one of my personal favorites, and Doug. While Rugrats only ended up airing for 3 seasons initially, the reruns became extremely popular, leading to a revival that began to air in 1997. This second run of the show was very successful and even led to multiple movies. You probably know where this is going, right? As with every successful franchise of the 90s, this also meant video games would be made. But in this case, it took a long time. 7 years, in fact, for Rugrats to become a video game, with its first attempt being a PlayStation 1 game called Rugrats Search for Reptar. The game has Tommy Pickles and company attempting to find missing puzzle pieces alongside Reptar bars. While the game wasn't a critical success, it caught on with audiences, becoming a greatest hits title and racking up 1.5 million sold copies. This meant that gamers would get more Rugrats games, including a sequel called Rugrats Studio Tour, multiple Game Boy games, an N64 title, and the list goes on. In total, the Rugrats have either been the star of or appeared in over 20 different video games. The Rugrats are now experiencing somewhat of a resurgence, returning with a new CG look in the 2021 Paramount Plus reboot. And now, in a strange twist of fate, the Rugrats have finally found their way to the NES all these years later, alongside other modern consoles, in Rugrats Adventures in Gameland. Rugrats Adventures in Gameland is a 2D platformer in a traditional 8-bit style that gives players the option of enjoying gorgeous HD art or the classic look of an NES release. Players are tasked with traveling between 5 different areas of the classic Rugrats house, filled with familiar faces and nightmare fuel that will be instantly recognizable from the show. Your goal is to collect enough Reptar coins across these areas to unlock the final Reptar dungeon, a challenging gauntlet that features aspects from every level in the game. The levels range from the inside of a fridge to bedrooms, a sandbox, and even the attic. Each level will have a screwdriver for you to find, which will open up the way to a boss battle. The storyline of the game involves Pop being left in charge of watching the kids for a while, but of course he ends up falling asleep. This leads to Angelica taking charge of things as usual and making the kids do whatever she tells them to. Suddenly, an advertisement on television for Reptar the video game catches Tommy and Chucky's attention and sends them on a quest to collect coins and find the video game. Players are able to cycle between 4 different characters. As I mentioned, you have Tommy, Chucky, Phil, and Lil. Similar to the iconic Super Mario Bros. 2, each character will feel a bit distinct. Chucky, for example, has the classic Luigi leg-kicking jump, while Lil can float with her dress just like Princess Peach. Outside of these unique attributes, each character mostly plays the same and can either jump on enemies, butt stomp them, or pick up items such as baby blocks and either set them down or toss them at foes. Certain areas throughout levels will also require you to crawl underneath hazards. Characters can sustain 4 hits of damage, but can also collect cookies that can refill their milk bottle, which represents health in this game. If you are playing the game solo, you can swap between characters at any time, depending on your difficulty level, and there's also a co-op mode for 2 local players. The swapping mechanic does add a bit of an element of strategy. Say Chucky is low on health, for example, you can stash him away for a while, and then select to play as him again when you come across milk. It's a neat little idea that helps alleviate some of the frustrations that classic games are known for. core fundamentals that make our blood boil while playing classic NES releases, however, still remain in Adventures in Gameland. Respawning enemies, floating Medusa heads, and frustrating platforming sections all make appearances throughout this 2 to 3 hour experience. You'll fail to make jumps and end up falling back to the previous screen. And yes, you'll let out an audible scream as you try to place a block to reach a higher ledge while enemy projectiles batter away at you. Thankfully, players can choose between 3 different difficulty options. Newborn allows for unlimited respawns, Baby, which is how I played, allows for the baby swapping mechanic, and the Expert mode has no baby swapping at all. Despite having its challenges, Adventures in Gameland still feels quite manageable when compared to much of what was available on the NES back in the day. The level design, however, it's a little flat at times. While the developers have done an unbelievable job of recreating the look of the show with a gorgeous HD visual option, the levels themselves just aren't all that interesting to travel through and can even feel a bit boring. The Reptar coins aren't very difficult to find either, meaning there isn't much room for exploration. The mechanics of the game also don't always feel as finely tuned as they should. The simple act of picking up blocks was often frustrating, and the platforming felt just a bit off to me. Rugrats Adventures in Gameland sometimes feels closer to a mediocre licensed knockoff of the past, as opposed to one of the great NES classics. It's not until the final Reptar dungeon that the game seems to find its footing a bit, but it's a little too late at that point. Making matters worse, the co-op mode is a complete disaster. If you value your relationships, don't play this together with loved ones. The game was clearly not designed with 2 players in mind, and it really shows. You'll scroll beyond your partner, take unnecessary damage, and ultimately resent the entire game should you decide to play this way. It's a shame because I love the option for local co-op, which is sadly a dying concept these days, but what's offered in Adventures in Gameland won't exactly instill confidence for developers to try it anytime soon in this style of game. All of this is to say, if you're planning to play, do so alone. The visuals, as I briefly touched on, are outstanding and true to the show. While I fully expected to gravitate towards the classic 8-bit look, it's the HD option that I ultimately stuck with. While the cutscenes aren't fully animated, it can be forgiven due to the game's presumably limited budget. Even still, the in-game graphics are really awesome and will hit fans of the original series directly in the feels. All of the characters are brought to life beautifully, and while the level design, as I mentioned, isn't always the strongest, the game at least looks incredible. Unfortunately, the 8-bit visuals seem to have received less attention overall. While having the option to toggle between both 8-bit and HD is nice, the classic look just doesn't feel all that classic. It never felt like I was playing a true NES game using the retro aesthetic, and I was ultimately a little disappointed in it. I will credit the team for trying to implement both styles, but I feel like that energy would have been better spent on improving some of the game's mechanics and level design. Much like the visuals, sound can also be toggled between a newer, more upbeat soundtrack or a classic chiptune style. Here, I preferred the chiptune soundtrack, though both are quite excellent. Fans of the show will be treated to the classic Rugrats theme, while fans of classic NES titles should enjoy most of the high-energy tracks presented. It's a good set of compositions, so when factoring everything, the game looks and sounds pretty dang impressive regardless of how I felt about the 8-bit visuals and their lack of charm. As far as performance was concerned, on my PC I did not come across any major issues with the game running at a locked 60 FPS, however on Steam Deck I did hit a few snags. The game would seize up from time to time when loading new areas, the music often glitched and repeated itself, and there were a few other small issues that cropped up when playing handheld. None of this was game-breaking, I was able to complete the game on Steam Deck, but there were a few scares here or there, so be aware of that if you're hoping to play it in handheld mode. For those of you looking to pick up the game digitally, this one's going to be priced at $24.99 USD, with the NES version looking to be $59.99. There will also be various editions of the game available physically, including a VHS version of the game and an orange cart. Rugrats Adventures in Gameland is a decent throwback that fans of the show will appreciate, but ultimately isn't as good as it should have been. With further tweaks to the gameplay and level design, this could have been a pretty dang good retro 2D platformer. It has decent bones and some pretty fun boss encounters too. Instead though, it ends up being a game that teeters on mediocrity at times, but has some redeeming qualities to it. I love the HD visuals and enjoyed going through that final level, but many of the worlds aren't all that fun to explore, nor are the mechanics always enjoyable to engage with. The tacked-on 2-player is also a big miss, but in the end, there was some fun to be had with this game. Here at I Dream of Indie Games, we believe games are so much more than a number. That's why we review based on our Genie Lamp system, with a bronze being a good game, a silver being a great game, and the golden Genie Lamp of approval for those essential indie releases. We also have the rusty lamp for games that are in pretty rough shape but have a faint glimmer of hope, and the dreaded Indie Krampus for titles that should be avoided at all costs. And when it comes to Rugrats Adventures in Gameland, while it teetered on mediocrity at times, I ultimately found enough redeeming qualities to award this one the bronze Genie Lamp of approval.